Talking today to Toby Green, who is the author of The Rise of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in Western Africa, 1300 to 1589. Toby, can you set the scene for us by describing the scale of the enforced human migration that was brought about by slavery?
Sure. The Transatlantic Slave Trade took place over a period I think is longer than many people often are aware. It started in the second decade of the 16th century, in the 1510s, and it carried on right through to the 1860s. So they're talking about a period of 350 years. Estimates vary as to the numbers of people who were transported in that time. They generally are at around 12 million or thereabouts. I often feel, and in fact as I argue in the book, that numbers aren't necessarily
You talk about imperfect European bureaucracies and their numbers.
I do, and especially because, for one reason, especially in the early period, as I argue in the book, the records we have are completely inadequate for making a sort of positivist approach, so finding in the records the numbers and assuming that that is the truth. But secondly, because from a sort of comparative point of view, the population was much smaller in the 16th century, so say 20,000 people in the 16th century is a completely different proportion in terms of human society and its impact than it would be in, say, the 20th century, where you have a much larger population. So that I think often does skew perceptions a little bit of quantification of slavery. But in terms of the broad number, we are talking about 12 million more or less in that period. Many more in the 18th and 19th centuries than in the 16th and 17th.
And slavery began a new phase in the twin phenomena of globalisation and capitalism. Why did it mark such a change with what went before in both economic and moral terms?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I think fundamentally it is because slavery is a very ancient human institution. Jamaican sociologist Orlando Patterson wrote a brilliant comparative history of slavery, and he looked at it in all its different forms. But one of the things that Orlando Patterson argued in that book, and I think is true, is that what fundamentally distinguished it in the Atlantic world, in the European imperial world, if you like, was its link to labour and to economically productive labour. So historically, the trans-Saharan slave trade, for example, across the Sahara to North Africa to the Maghreb, had traditionally the peoples transported in that trade had not been used so much for economically productive labour. They'd often been domestic servants. There had been people who were used in economic labour, but it was a much different...
The numbers were smaller.
They were smaller, although over the long durée they weren't that much smaller, but it would last for a much longer period. But the type of labour was different, and so fundamentally I think what is different in the Atlantic world is its connection to economic production, and of course that is fundamentally tied to the rise of global capitalism, the importance of economic production as both a system and an ideology.
And it becomes a way of accumulating capital.
That's
because
right.
if you have free labour,
that's right. Yes,
it turns in.
Yes, if you can control labour. And I think the other thing that is very important to remember, and is often forgotten actually in studies of African slavery in the Americas, is the other side of it, which is what happened in the New World. Because obviously, if the demographic, as I mentioned in the book, if you hadn't had a demographic collapse of the Native American population, you wouldn't have had a need for African slavery. The fundamental issue in the New World is labour, and where you are going to find labour from, because. And this is also connected to ideologies of the Spanish in the New World. The Spanish, because of the ideology which had grown out of the reconquest of Spain from the Muslim population, the hidalgos, the nobility, couldn't be seen dead doing any physical labour. So there was very much so rather unlike the Puritans, for example, in New England, there was a very different ideology about labour. And I think that's the question of labour is what is fundamental.
And in moral terms, what was the change?
Well, that's a huge question. And you would get very different answers from a lot of people. I don't know that there's a universal answer to that question, because it depends which population you're asking. Are you asking about moral terms in Africa? Are you asking about moral terms in Europe, in the Americas?
Let us do it in Africa.
Starting in Africa. Well, one of the fundamental changes in Africa is related to ritual and political organisation. And one of the things I show in the book is actually how the advent of Atlantic slavery began to affect political organisation, how, for example, among some groups in what is now Guinea-Bissau, you had people gathering in fortified villages, whereas before they'd lived in dispersed settlements, and that created different political structures, and more autocratic kingships in some parts of West Africa. And that obviously has moral consequences. And in ritual terms, there's a wonderful book by a scholar called Robert Baum, who writes about Senegambia in the 18th and 19th centuries, who shows how new shrines related to wealth accumulated through the slave trade developed, and how therefore the practice of selling people into slavery did affect ritual practices in West Africa. So, and there are there's a whole range of ways in which slavery and changes in ritual practice were connected, I think.